In the dim light of the medieval world, long before coffeehouses and clean running water, alcohol was everywhere. It flowed through monasteries and markets, through peasant huts and royal courts. Beer, ale, wine, mead, these were not luxuries, nor were they merely indulgences. They were staples of daily life, consumed by men and women, the old and the young, the pious and the profane. To modern eyes, medieval drinking habits seem excessive, even reckless. Chronicles speak of rivers of ale, of monks brewing stronger beer than soldiers could handle, of laborers drinking from sunrise to sunset. It raises a simple but unsettling question. Why did people in the Middle Ages drink so much alcohol? The answer begins with water, or rather, with the danger hidden inside it. In medieval towns and villages, clean drinking water was rare. Wells sat dangerously close to latrines. Rivers served simultaneously as water sources, sewage channels, and dumping grounds for animal carcasses and industrial waste. The concept of germ theory was centuries away. People did not understand bacteria, parasites, or microscopic contamination. They only knew the results. Drinking raw water often led to sickness, dysentery, and death. Alcoholic beverages, especially beer and ale, were safer. The brewing process required boiling water, which killed many pathogens. Fermentation added another layer of protection, creating an environment hostile to harmful organisms. Even weak beer, what historians call small beer, was often safer than water. As a result, alcohol became not just a pleasure, but a defense against disease. Small beer was everywhere. It was low in alcohol, sometimes no stronger than 1 or 2%, and it was consumed daily by entire households. Children drank it. Workers drank it in the fields. Monks drank it during prayers. It hydrated, nourished, and protected. In many places, it was considered irresponsible not to drink it. But safety was only part of the story. Medieval diets were harsh and monotonous. For most people, daily food consisted of bread, porridge, and whatever vegetables or scraps of meat could be obtained. Alcohol filled nutritional gaps. Beer contained calories, carbohydrates, and trace nutrients from grains and yeast. In an age of constant physical labor, these calories mattered. For laborers, alcohol was fuel. Farmhands were often paid partly in ale. Builders received beer rations at construction sites. Harvest festivals were soaked in drink, not only as celebration but as recovery from exhausting work. Alcohol dulled pain, eased hunger, and softened the relentless pressure of survival. It also brought warmth. Medieval Europe was cold. Homes were poorly insulated. Winters were long and brutal. Alcohol created a sensation of heat, a temporary relief from the cold. Though medically misleading, the warming effect felt real, and in a world without central heating, it was deeply valued. Yet alcohol was more than a tool for survival. It was woven into the social and spiritual fabric of medieval life. Taverns were the beating hearts of towns. They were places of news, gossip, trade, and negotiation. Contracts were sealed over drinks. Disputes were resolved or inflamed by alcohol. Travelers found shelter in inns where ale was often safer than food. To refuse a drink could be interpreted as an insult, a sign of mistrust or arrogance. Religious institutions were no exception. Monasteries were among the largest producers of alcohol in medieval Europe. Monks brewed beer, fermented wine, and perfected techniques that would influence brewing for centuries. Alcohol was integrated into religious routine. The rule of Saint Benedict allowed monks daily wine rations, acknowledging human weakness rather than denying it. Some monasteries became famous for the strength of their beer. Fasting periods restricted solid food, but liquid calories were permitted. This led to rich, dense brews designed to sustain monks through weeks of religious abstinence. In this context, alcohol was not sinful, it was practical, even holy. Of course, the Church preached moderation. Drunkenness was condemned as a moral failure. Sermons warned against excess, against losing control, against the dangers of intoxication. But the line between necessity and excess was thin and often ignored. Alcohol also played a role in medicine. Medieval doctors prescribed wine for digestion, beer for strength, and spirits when available for pain relief. Alcohol was used to clean wounds, extract herbal compounds, and calm the nerves. It was one of the few substances that reliably altered the body's state, and that made it powerful in a world with limited medical knowledge. Pain, fear, and uncertainty defined medieval existence. Life expectancy was low. Infant mortality was high. Plagues, famines, and wars were constant threats. Alcohol offered temporary escape. It softened reality, dulled anxiety, and created moments of joy in lives otherwise filled with hardship. But this reliance came at a cost. Chronic drunkenness was a known problem. Legal records describe brawls, domestic violence, and accidents fueled by alcohol. Cities attempted regulation, limiting tavern hours or banning certain drinks. Moralists complained that alehouses corrupted the poor and distracted them from honest work. Despite this, alcohol consumption remained deeply normalized. It was expected. It was structured into daily routines. It was rarely questioned. Even gender did not restrict drinking. Women brewed beer at home, a role so common that brewing was once considered women's work. Alewaves sold beer in markets and inns. Housewives drank with meals. Alcohol was not a masculine vice alone, it was a household constant. By the late Middle Ages, stronger drinks began to appear. Distillation techniques spread across Europe, producing spirits with far higher alcohol content. These drinks were initially used for medicine, but their intoxicating power was quickly recognized. With them came new concerns, new moral panics, and new patterns of abuse. Still, the foundations had already been laid. Medieval society had built itself around alcohol for safety, for nutrition, for social order, for spiritual comfort, and for escape. To understand why people in the Middle Ages drank so much, we must abandon modern assumptions. This was not a world of leisure drinking, weekend excess, or recreational intoxication. It was a world where alcohol was often the safest liquid available, a source of energy, and a psychological shield against relentless hardship. In the shadows of stone walls and flickering candles, with death never far away, alcohol was not simply consumed, it was trusted, it was needed, and for many, it was the only comfort they could reliably afford. As medieval cities grew denser, the role of alcohol became even more entrenched. Urban life intensified every problem that drink helped to mask. Overcrowding, filth, noise, disease, and constant insecurity defined city existence. In these conditions, alcohol was both lubricant and anesthetic. It smoothed social friction and dulled the edges of urban misery. Guilds regulated brewing with strict rules, not to reduce consumption, but to ensure stability. Beer quality mattered because beer was infrastructure. A bad batch could sicken an entire neighborhood. A shortage could provoke unrest. Municipal authorities monitored brewers closely, setting prices and standards, understanding that alcohol was as essential as bread. This normalization of alcohol reshaped behavior from childhood onward. Young people were introduced to drinking early, not as rebellion, but as routine. There was no sharp line between sobriety and intoxication. Mild intoxication was a constant background state for many, a gentle haze that softened labor and ritual alike. Modern ideas of addiction did not exist. There was no concept of alcoholism as a disease. Excessive drinking was seen as a moral weakness or a failure of discipline, not a condition requiring treatment. As long as one could work, pray, and fulfill social obligations, drinking was tolerated, even encouraged. This blurred boundary explains why medieval sources often sound contradictory. Writers condemn drunkenness in moral terms, yet casually describe enormous quantities of alcohol being consumed. The contradiction is real only to modern ears. In medieval society, drinking was acceptable until it disrupted order. The problem was not how much you drank, but whether your drinking caused visible harm. And harm, when it occurred, was often violent. Alcohol amplified aggression in a world already saturated with it. Legal records from medieval courts are filled with assaults that began in taverns, knives drawn in drunken arguments. Insults escalated into bloodshed. Alehouses were social centers, but also flashpoints. Many cities required taverns to close at nightfall, not out of moral concern, but to prevent violence. Still, taverns remained indispensable. They were meeting places for travelers, labor brokers, and messengers. News traveled through drink. Political rumors spread across ale-stained tables. Rebellions were planned in inns. Revolutions were whispered into mugs. Even kings understood this power. Royal courts consumed alcohol on a staggering scale. Feasts were drenched in wine. Diplomacy unfolded over banquets designed to impress, overwhelm, and intoxicate. To drink with the king was a sign of favor. To refuse was dangerous. Alcohol reinforced hierarchy. The wealthy drank wine, often imported and expensive. The poor drank beer and ale. Quality, strength, and flavor marked social class. Drinking was universal, but never equal. Climate also played a role. Medieval Europe experienced long periods of cold weather, including the early phases of what historians now call the Little Ice Age. Harvest failures were common. Wine production fluctuated. Beer, made from grains that could survive harsher conditions, became more reliable. This further cemented its dominance, especially in Northern Europe. Alcohol also preserved calories when food storage was limited. Grain turned into beer lasted longer than grain left to rot. Fermentation transformed surplus into stability. Brewing was not wasteful, it was strategic. And then there was fear. Fear was omnipresent. Fear of God, fear of illness, fear of famine, fear of sudden death. Alcohol helped manage that fear. It lowered inhibitions, making prayer feel closer, laughter easier, despair quieter. It did not solve problems, but it made them bearable. This psychological function cannot be overstated. Medieval people lived with constant reminders of mortality, public executions, open graves during plagues, bells tolling for the dead. Alcohol provided moments where that weight lifted, even briefly. But the same substance that comforted also numbed. Innovation slowed under intoxication. Productivity suffered. Some moral reformers noticed this and spoke out. By the late medieval period, critics warned that excessive drinking weakened society. They blamed alcohol for laziness, crime, and moral decay. These voices grew louder as cities expanded and social discipline became more important. Still, reform moved slowly. The economic interests were too strong. Brewers, tavern keepers, landlords, and governments all profited from alcohol. Taxes on drink funded wars and infrastructure. To restrict alcohol too harshly risked unrest. Alcohol had become untouchable. As centuries passed, its role evolved, but its presence never faded. By the time the medieval world gave way to early modern Europe, drinking habits were deeply embedded. What changed was not consumption, but perception. New ideas about health, productivity, and self-control slowly emerged. But during the Middle Ages, alcohol was not an escape from life. It was part of life itself. It was breakfast and wages, medicine and prayer, celebration and sedation. It accompanied birth and death, work and rest, faith and doubt. It filled cups because it filled needs that nothing else could. To judge medieval people by modern standards is to misunderstand their reality. They did not drink because they were careless or ignorant. They drank because their world demanded it. In a landscape of uncertainty, alcohol offered reliability. In a society without safety nets, it provided comfort. In an age without clean water, it was survival. And so the medieval cup was rarely empty, not because people were lost, but because they were enduring. In the final centuries of the medieval world, alcohol had become so deeply embedded in daily life that imagining society without it was almost impossible. Drinking was not questioned because it did not feel optional. It was tradition hardened into habit, habit reinforced by necessity. Yet subtle changes were already underway. As trade expanded and cities grew wealthier, new ideas began to circulate. Scholars revisited ancient texts on moderation. Physicians slowly refined their understanding of the body. Moral reformers, especially within the church, began to speak more urgently about discipline, productivity, and restraint. Alcohol was still everywhere, but it was no longer invisible. Urban authorities tightened regulations. Tavern licenses became harder to obtain. Fines for disorderly drunkenness increased. Some cities limited the strength of beer sold to the poor, fearing unrest and decline. These measures were not driven by health concerns as we understand them today, but by order. A drunk population was unpredictable, and unpredictability threatened power. Still, consumption remained high. Part of the reason was generational continuity. Children raised on small beer became adults who saw alcohol as normal nourishment. There was no moment of initiation, no dramatic first drink. Drinking was learned the way walking or working was learned gradually, unremarkably, and without reflection. Alcohol also preserved community. Shared drinking created bonds in a fragmented world. It erased social distance for brief moments. Peasant and merchant, traveler and local, all met at the same tables. In a rigidly hierarchical society, this mattered. Alcohol softened rank, if only temporarily, and it created memory. Songs, stories, jokes, and local legends were born in taverns. Oral culture thrived where literacy was limited, and alcohol fueled storytelling. History itself was often remembered through drink: who said what, who fought whom, who betrayed whom, all recalled through ale-soaked recollection. But the medieval relationship with alcohol was fragile. When plague struck, drinking intensified. When famine arrived, it sometimes decreased, sometimes surged. During war, armies marched on beer and wine, as much as bread. Soldiers drank to steady their nerves before battle, to numb trauma afterward. Alcohol followed violence, and violence followed alcohol. This cycle reinforced dependence. Yet medieval people rarely framed this dependence as weakness. Survival required endurance, not reflection. The luxury of self-analysis belonged to later centuries. In the Middle Ages, you endured first. You asked questions later if you lived long enough. The arrival of distilled spirits marked a turning point. Stronger than beer or wine, spirits altered behavior more dramatically. Authorities noticed faster intoxication, deeper loss of control, harsher social consequences. What had once been a constant mild haze now had the potential to become sudden collapse. This shift laid the groundwork for future moral revolutions. By the early modern period, debates over alcohol sharpened. Drinking was still common, but it was no longer unquestioned. The medieval balance alcohol as necessity began to fracture. Looking back, it is easy to misunderstand medieval drinking as excess without restraint. In truth, it was excess shaped by circumstance. A world without clean water, without medicine, without security, without comfort, built rituals around what worked. Alcohol worked. It killed fewer people than water. It preserved calories. It eased pain. It created warmth where there was cold, joy where there was despair, and community where there was isolation. It blurred fear in an age that offered little else to soften it. To remove alcohol from the medieval world would not have made it healthier. It would have made it unbearable. The Middle Ages were not an era of ignorance drowned in drink. They were an era of survival soaked in necessity. Alcohol was not an escape from reality, it was a tool for living within it. And so, when we imagine medieval streets echoing with laughter from taverns, or monasteries heavy with the scent of brewing grain, we should not see carelessness. We should see adaptation. A society doing what it could with what it had, raising a cup not because life was easy, but because it was hard.